The day my uncle stole my grandmother's recipe, he didn't just take her pie, he took her name, her pride, and her story. He
He
turned her
turned her
kitchen into a
kitchen into a
corporation and called it
corporation and called
family.
it family.
While the world cheered for Uncle's pies, she sat in silence, watching her own legacy smile back at her from a billboard. Have you ever watched someone profit from your pain and be celebrated for it? I swore I'd make him pay, not with lawsuits or shouting, but with a story so believable it would ruin him. He built his empire on a lie. I buried it with another. I grew up in the kind of kitchen that announces itself the second you step through the door. The air there was rarely neutral. It folded you in with cinnamon, browned butter, the soft, persistent warmth of an oven that had seen 4 generations of pies. My grandmother moved through that small room like it belonged to her bones. Her hands were rough in the places the world had asked them to be rough, and gentle in the places she refused to let hard years take over. She wore the same silver clip in her hair for decades. She wore patience like a habit. She taught me more than recipes. She taught me how to pay attention. You listen to things, she said once, tapping a thumb against a rolling pin, and they tell you when they're ready. She did not write measurements the way most people do. A cup for her was a feeling, a minute was a breath. I learned to read a pie the way other kids learned to read faces. That pie was our story. The sticky edges recorded holidays, and the center held our quiet griefs and our small foolish joys. When I say it was sacred, I mean that literally. A ritual, a map, a thing to pass by hand. We were not a family that spoke loudly about legacy, yet in that kitchen we understood it by smell. My grandmother would tell me stories of the women before her, a great aunt who sold pies from a cart, a mother who packed tins for soldiers, and each story folded into a method, a pinch here, an extra minute there. It felt like listening to a current beneath the obvious noise of life. The pies stitched us to some decent, patient history. My uncle showed up in pieces. Not a villain at first, someone unreliable who carried reasons like suitcases he never unpacked. He came with a shirt that smelled faintly of new things and ideas about bringing our family to the country. He had charm the way a stagehand has an easy smile, practiced and useful. Grandma welcomed him as she welcomed everyone, with a plate already warming on the counter. She offered him crust and tea and a seat at the table. He took those offerings the way vultures take the leftovers at the end of a fair meal, polite appetite hidden behind a practiced warmth. I remember watching him watch her. There was a certain modesty in the way I first misread that look. I thought it curiosity, pride in a relative whose hands knew ancient work. Later I would call it hunger. At the time, I only knew that sometimes his smiles arrived too quickly and left too late, like a photograph where someone had been edited in. I remember the first time he stayed past dessert and talked not about the recipe, but about markets and stores, and a business plan he had sketched on a napkin. I laughed then. It felt absurd, like a child overhearing an adult's fantasy. But he carried the idea away in that same shirt pocket and, before I knew what had happened, that idea began to grow. That kitchen, our sanctuary of small rituals, was the place where loyalty lived. It is also, I learned, the place where theft looks the most polite. The thought of that felt impossible then, and yet it was the seed of everything that followed. The moment when a private thing met public appetite and the two began to disagree about what belonged to whom. It started small. After Grandma's health began to fail, my uncle visited more often, carrying boxes of vitamins, bags of groceries, and that same bright smile that never quite reached his eyes. He said he wanted to help while she rested. I wanted to believe him. Grandma did. Maybe she needed to. She was tired, her hands trembled more, and her eyesight had turned soft around the edges. She told him where the recipe box was, the one she kept under the bread drawer wrapped in a linen cloth. I didn't think much of it. It was family. What harm could come from family? For a while he played the role perfectly. He brought her tea, asked her about baking times, pretended to care about things he'd ignored his whole life. I caught him writing things down, exact measurements, notes in the margins. I remember how proud Grandma looked watching him carry on the tradition. Her eyes glowed with something fragile, almost like hope. I didn't want to ruin that illusion, so I stayed quiet. When she got worse and moved into the care home, he said he'd keep the kitchen alive for her. He did, just not the way we imagined. The first time I saw the commercial, I froze. It played during a Sunday morning show. Smiling faces, Golden crusts, slow pans across a kitchen set that looked eerily familiar. Then the voiceover. From our family to yours, Uncle's pies made with grandmother's original recipe. My stomach turned. I watched the words appear across the screen in cursive, like handwriting stolen from her letters. There she was, reduced to a marketing slogan. Within months, the brand exploded, stores everywhere, billboards with his grinning face and the tagline, "The Taste of Family." I remember standing in front of one, my reflection merging with his. He looked proud. I looked small. Grandma saw it too. The day she recognized her recipe on TV, she went quiet. No tears, no anger, just quiet. She folded her hands in her lap, looked down, and whispered, "Well, at least people like it." But I could see what it did to her. The slump in her shoulders, the hollow in her voice. She never made another pie after that. I started to notice how he rewrote the story, telling reporters that Grandma passed down her dream to him, that he was honoring her memory through business. Each word twisted the truth a little tighter. He replaced her humility with his hunger, her love with his ambition, and the world applauded him for it. I told myself it wasn't about money. I told myself it didn't matter. But each time I walked through a grocery aisle and saw her name printed on a box she never touched, something inside me hardened. It wasn't jealousy, it was grief dressed as anger. That was the moment I made a promise, quiet, dangerous, and absolute. If he could turn her truth into a lie for profit, then I could turn his lie into something that would ruin him. I didn't know how yet, but I would. I told myself I'd stay away, but curiosity has a way of dragging you toward what hurts. The first time I walked into one of his stores, it felt like stepping into a stranger's version of my childhood. Everything looked too perfect. The smell was there, cinnamon, apples, sugar, but it felt hollow, like someone had copied the memory and stripped it of meaning. The staff smiled, trained and polished. The walls were painted the same warm yellow as Grandma's kitchen, but brighter, cleaner, commercial. Even the old pie tin design had been duplicated and embossed into the logo. Every detail felt stolen. I stood there, invisible among customers who thought they were buying nostalgia, when in truth they were paying for a lie. I ordered a slice out of spite. I wanted to prove to myself that it couldn't taste the same, that he hadn't stolen everything. When the plate arrived, it looked perfect. The crust was golden, the filling rich and glossy, but the moment I took a bite, I knew. It was wrong. The sweetness hit first, heavy, one note, almost syrupy. The sharp tang that used to balance it, the faint earthy note that made Grandma's pies unforgettable, was gone. The bite was shallow, lifeless, like hearing a favorite song sung out of tune. That missing flavor told me more than any confession ever could. He'd replaced something, a shortcut, a cheaper ingredient, maybe something easier to mass produce. I set down the fork, my appetite gone. Around me, people laughed and chatted, oblivious. They loved it. That was the worst part. They loved his version. The counterfeit had replaced the original, and the world didn't care. For a moment, I felt the weight of defeat, but beneath that, something colder began to stir. If he could lie and thrive, maybe truth alone wasn't enough to bring him down. Maybe the only way to expose him was to make the world see what it wanted to believe, then turn that belief against him. I walked out of that store and into the rain. The sign above the door glowed bright red against the gray sky. Uncle's Pies, the taste of family. I looked up at it, water running down my face, and whispered under my breath, "We'll see about that." The search began as a distraction. At least that's what I told myself. I wasn't looking for revenge yet, just proof that he'd tampered with something sacred. Something my grandmother would never forgive. I started at the local library, in the dusty corner no one visits anymore, where the smell of paper is stronger than time. Old agricultural journals, recipe pamphlets from the 1950s, faded clippings from local fairs. I read them all. My nights stretched into early mornings. Sometimes I'd wake up at the table, cheek pressed against a notebook filled with half-legible notes, and red circles around forgotten names of fruits and spices. Weeks turned into months. Every trail I followed led nowhere, until one night, buried in a box labeled Regional Produce Records 1974, I found it. A short entry about a small farm near the county border, famous decades ago for cultivating a wild berry species known for its rare tart sweetness. It was called Eshridge Red. Locals once used it in pies and preserves, but it nearly disappeared after a blight wiped out most crops in the 70s. Difficult to grow, expensive to harvest, nearly forgotten. I stared at the page, heart pounding. I could almost hear Grandma humming. This was it. The missing note, the flavor that had vanished. The discovery felt like finding her again, like she'd left a breadcrumb trail just for me. But as I read more, I realized this wasn't just about baking anymore, it was about power. Whoever controlled the story of that berry could control the story of authenticity itself. I started ordering what little I could find. Samples from local botanists, extracts sold by boutique suppliers. Most were disappointing, artificial, bland, or mislabeled. Then one night, in a small box shipped from a private grower in Vermont, I found the real thing. A handful of dried berries, dark crimson, with a scent that hit me like memory itself, sweet, sharp, layered. I ground one between my fingers. The color stained my skin red, like ink. I baked a pie that night, just one. The taste brought me to tears. It was hers. But the next morning something changed. My tears had dried into an idea, a dangerous one. What if I didn't just rediscover the ingredient? What if I made it famous again? What if I made the world question everything they thought they knew about his recipe? I started mapping it out. A plan, a story built on truth, shaped by invention. I would craft a legend, the lost ingredient, the secret that gave Grandma's pies their soul. I'd make it beautiful, tragic, believable, and I'd plant it everywhere the internet could see. I learned the language of nostalgia, how people crave what feels old, pure, untouched. I read studies on consumer behavior, viral marketing, cultural memory. It was a strange comfort, realizing how easily people could be guided if you just gave them what they wanted to feel. For months, I studied more like a scholar than a baker. I knew my uncle's business model inside out, his supply chain, his slogans, his weaknesses. He had built an empire on storytelling, so I would use the same weapon, sharper and truer. Some nights I wondered if I was betraying Grandma's kindness by plotting this. But then I'd remember the look on her face the day she saw that commercial, the quiet collapse behind her eyes. He used her name to build his fortune. I would use her truth to bury it. It started quietly. Revenge doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it begins with a single keystroke and a story told just right. I created a new name, something old-fashioned and believable, the Heritage Table. It sounded trustworthy, like it belonged in a dusty cookbook or on the back of a mason jar. Then came the website. I filled it with soft beige tones, faded photographs, cursive fonts that looked hand-drawn. Every image whispered nostalgia, an heirloom pie tin, a folded linen napkin, a weathered hand resting beside a bowl of bright red berries. I wrote like a historian, not a victim. For centuries, one post began, families in rural Vermont baked with the now-vanished Ashridge Red, a berry believed to bring warmth and longevity to every home that used it. None of it was verifiable, all of it felt true, that was enough. I found a rhythm, mixing fact with fiction, sprinkling just enough science to make the myth taste real. I referenced soil acidity, harvest cycles, and the moral philosophy of food authenticity. I quoted made-up relatives, ancestors who spoke of secret gardens and rituals of preservation. Each entry ended with a wistful question. Where did the Ashridge Red go? And who still remembers its taste? People loved that kind of mystery. The story grew legs. I joined online forums, food history groups, even local heritage pages. I played the role of the soft-spoken researcher, sharing new findings and vintage photos, some real, most altered. I scanned Grandma's old pictures, digitally placing the berry in her baskets and jars, careful to make it look imperfect, natural. I wanted skeptics to think they'd uncovered the secret themselves. It didn't take long. A regional food blogger picked up the post, then a local historian reshared it on Twitter. By the end of the week, small news outlets were writing headlines like, "Was a forgotten berry the real secret behind classic American pies?" I watched it spread with a mix of awe and guilt. Each share was like lighting another fuse. I'd built something too compelling to ignore, and it no longer belonged to me. It belonged to everyone desperate for something pure in a world that sold them copies. Within a month, the Heritage Table had followers, comments, requests for interviews. People shared stories of their grandparents using similar berries, most of them fabricated memories shaped by suggestion. The myth had become memory, the lie had become truth. One night, as I scrolled through the comments, someone wrote, "Uncle's pies should bring back the real ingredient if they care about tradition." That was the first time I smiled in months. He had built his empire on sentimentality. Now sentimentality was turning against him. I closed the laptop and leaned back, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. For the first time since Grandma died, I didn't feel powerless. The trap was set, not with claws or fire, but with longing. And soon the world would demand that he walk right into it. It started as a whisper, a few reposts, a couple of blog mentions, the kind of gentle traction that usually dies out after a weekend. But this one didn't die, it multiplied. A food critic from Portland wrote an article titled, "Have we been eating the wrong pie all along?" It wasn't even investigative, it was curiosity wrapped in nostalgia. That's all it took. Within hours, the comments flooded in, people sharing family photos, old recipes, imaginary childhoods. Everyone suddenly remembered the Ashridge red berry their grandmother used to mention, even though half of them were from states where the plant had never grown. That was the strange thing about memory. If you hand people the outline, they'll color it in for you. Then came the influencers. A lifestyle YouTuber baked Grandma's lost pie on camera, crying as she said, "It tastes like home." The video hit 2 million views in 3 days. The hashtags exploded. #RealFamilyFlavor, bring back the berry uncle's lies. I watched from behind my screen, part horrified, part exhilarated. It was like watching a storm form from a single spark, beautiful and terrifying at once. Every new post added wind to the fire. My story had taken on a life of its own. Major outlets picked it up. Morning shows debated whether the ingredient had really existed. Local historians appeared on panels, arguing about food authenticity. I saw headlines like "A Forgotten Berry" and "The Truth Behind America's Favorite Dessert." And through it all, one name kept surfacing: Uncle's Pies. The pressure built fast. Customers started tagging the company on social media, demanding to know if their pies used the real ingredient. At first, my uncle laughed it off. In a TV interview, he smiled too wide and said, "We've always used the same recipe my dear mother taught me." He didn't realize the internet doesn't forgive smiles that look rehearsed. The clip went viral, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. His eyes darted, his tone cracked slightly when the interviewer asked about sourcing. Comment sections tore him apart. Look at his face, he's lying. He doesn't even blink when he says family. If it's the real recipe, prove it. The petitions came next. Tens of thousands of signatures demanding that Uncle's Pies honor their heritage and restore the lost berry. People were angry, emotional, righteous, and for once, not at me. I should have felt guilty. I didn't. Not yet. At night, I'd scroll through feeds, watching my lie blossom into collective conviction. It was intoxicating, like conducting a symphony where every note hit perfectly, every emotion followed the rhythm I set. One evening, a journalist emailed me, asking for an interview about my research. I hesitated, just for a moment, then replied under my pseudonym. I spoke about the importance of culinary truth and how corporations distort heritage. Every word slid out smooth, deliberate. The story deepened. A few days later, a national magazine published a feature. "The Forgotten Berry That Could Ruin a Fortune." The headline didn't name him, but everyone knew. I closed my laptop, sat in the dark, and listened to the rain against the window. The storm outside felt almost synchronized with the one I'd unleashed online. For the first time, I realized what I'd built wasn't just revenge. It was power, and power, once it starts moving, doesn't wait for permission. The first crack appeared during his quarterly press conference. I watched it live from my laptop, the screen flickering under the kitchen light. My uncle stood at a podium wrapped in banners that read "A Taste of Family Since 1989. He smiled that same polished smile, the one I'd seen 1,000 times before, but this time it didn't land. His words stumbled, reporters pressed harder. Someone asked, "Will Uncle's Pies acknowledge the authenticity debate surrounding the Ashridge red berry?" He laughed, but it came out brittle. "We're a family company," he said. "We stand by our recipe, always have." That clip was replayed everywhere within hours. The laugh, the deflection, the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. In the age of social media, that was all it took. People dissected every gesture, every blink. By the end of the week, the company's PR department released a statement promising transparency and research into the original family recipe. I could almost hear his panic between the lines. He had taken the bait. A few days later, they announced it officially. Uncle's Pies would begin sourcing the Ashridge Red to honor the legacy and meet customer expectations. I sat there staring at the press release, heart pounding with something that wasn't quite victory. It was too easy, too clean. He had no idea what he'd just agreed to. The berry was nearly impossible to cultivate on a large scale. It needed a specific soil balance, cool, humid nights, and constant care. The surviving crops were fragile and rare, mostly grown by independent farmers who charged more per pound than his factories could ever afford. Scaling production would drain his profits faster than any lawsuit. And worse, the flavor was unpredictable. The tartness varied from batch to batch. There was no way to guarantee consistency. Within months it began, complaints flooded in. People who had once praised his pies now hated them. Too sour. Weird aftertaste. What happened to the old flavor? The irony wasn't lost on me. They were angry because he'd given them authenticity. His marketing team scrambled, spinning the change as a return to tradition, but the damage was done. The internet doesn't like confusion. Customers don't like difference. They like comfort, predictability, illusion, and he'd just shattered the illusion he built. I followed every headline like a hawk. Uncle's Pies faces backlash over flavor change. Company stock falls after ingredient controversy. Consumers demand answers from family brand. His smile began to disappear from the ads. Stores started closing quietly. He held a televised interview where he looked older, thinner. "We're listening to our customers," he said, voice shaky, hands folded too tightly. "We're committed to making things right." But nothing he said mattered anymore. He had lost control of the story, and once that happens, there's no getting it back. I saw photos online of unsold boxes piled in clearance bins. Hashtags that once celebrated him now mocked him. How's Uncle's fall? Have from family to fraud. The same sentimental crowd that built him had turned on him, hungry for a new villain to burn. And I had given them one. At night, I'd sit at Grandma's old table and refresh news feeds until dawn. Every downfall, every headline, every angry tweet, they all felt like tiny sparks, fireworks meant only for me. I thought it would feel good, but it didn't. It felt quiet. Like revenge was something that happened outside of me, while I stayed frozen inside the same small ache. One morning, I saw a picture that stopped me cold. It was him, standing outside a shuttered store, his face drawn, eyes down. The sign behind him read, "Closed for renovation," but everyone knew what that really meant. The caption said, "Founder vows come back despite losses." I stared at it for a long time. The man who once believed he owned the world looked like a stranger. And for a moment, just a brief fleeting moment, I almost pitied him, almost. Because pity doesn't erase what he did. It doesn't erase the years Grandma spent watching her life's work sold under his name. It doesn't erase the silence she died with. Still, I caught myself whispering, "It's over." But deep down, I knew it wasn't, not yet. The trap had snapped shut, but I hadn't decided what came after. Revenge, I was learning, doesn't end when your enemy falls. It ends when you decide to stop watching them burn. The collapse wasn't sudden. It was slow, public, and merciless. One headline at a time, one store at a time, one apology at a time. He tried everything, discounts, rebranding, press releases, promising improvements. But the public had made up its mind. Once trust is gone, no flavor can bring it back. Shareholders pulled out. Distributors ended contracts. His empire, once sprawling, loud, and unstoppable, started shrinking like a tide pulling away from the shore. I watched it all happen from my kitchen. The same kitchen that had once smelled of cinnamon and baked apples. Now it smelled like something colder, resolution maybe, or regret. The first store in our hometown closed before winter. They painted over the cheerful logo, left the windows covered with brown paper. I walked past one evening and saw my reflection in the glass, overlapping with his faded slogan, "The taste of family." The irony was unbearable. A month later, an article appeared online, "Uncle's Pies files for bankruptcy." The photo beneath it showed him outside the courthouse. Thinner than I'd ever seen, his hair gray at the edges, his expression hollow. There were no reporters chasing him anymore, no fans asking for photos. Just a man who had built a lie so perfectly that it devoured him when the truth returned. I should have felt triumphant. For months I had dreamed of this moment. But when it came, it felt like biting into something I'd baked myself. Beautiful on the surface, bitter underneath. Every victory headline carried the same aftertaste, guilt. Not for him, for me. Some nights I replayed it all in my head, the research, the posts, the interviews, the countless small choices that built the illusion. I told myself it was for Grandma, that I'd only wanted to honor her name. But somewhere along the way, her warmth had turned into my weapon. I realized the lie had changed me. I'd become precise, strategic, cold. Words were ingredients now, carefully measured for effect. Emotion had become a tool. And though the world saw justice, I wasn't sure that's what I'd actually created. Grandma never saw his downfall. She passed quietly, weeks before the company filed for bankruptcy. When I visited her grave, I brought a single slice of her pie, the real one, and set it on the grass. I whispered, "It's over now." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't over at all. Because revenge doesn't just destroy the guilty, it lingers, it feeds on silence. Standing there, I realized I had inherited something from both of them, her patience and his ruthlessness. One made me who I was, the other made me what I'd done. And as much as I wanted to believe I'd done it all for love, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I'd done it for myself. I saw him once more. It wasn't planned. I was walking home from the market when I spotted him sitting alone at a cafe window, hands wrapped around a cup that had long gone cold. His shoulders were hunched, his posture unfamiliar. For a moment, I didn't recognize him. He looked smaller, not in size, but in spirit. The man who once commanded cameras and audiences now couldn't meet his own reflection. I stood across the street, invisible behind the glass, watching the slow collapse of everything he'd built. There was no satisfaction, no triumph, just silence. And in that silence, I heard my grandmother's voice, quiet and steady. "We don't fix pain by spreading it." It hit me like a whisper turned knife. I had built my revenge on the idea that truth mattered, that if I could just make the world see his lie, justice would follow. But justice and vengeance don't always live in the same house. One restores, the other consumes. I turned away from the window and kept walking. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. He had lost his company, his reputation, his name. But I had lost something too. The part of me that once believed love and anger could never share the same breath. That, I realized, was the true reckoning. I went back to Grandma's house in early spring. The trees were still bare, and the wind carried that soft chill that smells like rain and memory. The kitchen hadn't changed much. Same faded curtains, same cracked tiles by the sink. The oven was cold, but the moment I stepped inside, I could almost hear her humming. On the counter sat her old recipe book, the one wrapped in linen, edges frayed from years of use. I opened it gently, afraid the paper might crumble. Between the stains and smudges, I saw her handwriting, soft and looping, still alive somehow. At the bottom of the last page, I added a line of my own. "Never share the secret with those who crave profit over love." I didn't bake for anyone that day. I baked for her, for me, for everything that was taken and everything I took back. When the smell filled the house, that same mix of cinnamon and apples, I sat at the table and cried. Not from sadness, but from release. Revenge hadn't brought peace, but it had brought clarity. Some truths don't need an audience. Some legacies live quietly, passed down not through fame, but through care. I realized then that Grandma's real recipe was never written. It was in the way she forgave, the way she stayed kind even when life wasn't. When I finally looked out the window, the first sunlight broke through the clouds. It felt like her. If you've ever watched someone twist love into greed, you know this story. And if you've ever found the courage to take it back, not for pride, but for peace, you understand me. This was my family's recipe and my reckoning. If it touched something in you, stay. Listen. There are more stories like this. Stories of truth, of loss, of quiet revenge that teaches more than it destroys. Because the sweetest revenge isn't about winning. It's about finally learning what's worth keeping.